So it is certainly strange. Oh, LWN is taking a picture of me in front of a Mac. I know exactly why Jake is taking a picture. So to be at a Linux conference and to successively not to have to use less and less free software machines. Karen and I are giving a talk on Thursday, I think it is, about this issue of how it's becoming harder and harder to use free software in the world, even as free software becomes more popular. So this is an example of that. I tried my 100% free software Trinity machine, did not work with the setup. Tried the 98% free software machine, did not work.
5 more minutes. I was not even. 30 more seconds. If you had asked me to mirror it, we would have been golden.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to do mirror presentations. Okay, what?
I'm going to be honest, when I saw Bradley submitted a talk, I actually first thought he'd submitted it to the wrong miniconf. But when I read the talk, I was actually really excited, and he's going to be our closing talk for the game session, so please join me in thanking Bradley.
So, admittedly, my talk was only accepted 6 days ago.
No, I swear I clicked it before then. I swear I did.
You definitely didn't. I got an email 6 days ago that said my talk was accepted and I had a month to prepare it. I'm not sure how that math works out. But I did prepare it in 6 days. It has fewer pictures in it than I would have wanted. So it's a very textual talk for a game presentation, I suppose. And as has been pointed out, this is not the kind of thing I usually talk about. And I usually don't need these kind of disclaimer slides. But these are my opinions, not my employer's. I am going to talk about software freedom, which my employer is a big fan of, and so those views align. I think my employer would agree that proprietary software is bad for anything, including online poker software, so that probably aligns. But I have lots of other opinions about proprietary software poker and poker in general and so forth that my employer probably has no position on whatsoever. So as you know, I'm better known for submitting to other mini-confs, not the games mini-conf. But for about 3 years back in the late 2000s, I spent my weekends working on a FOSS game. And as a person who was often saying games aren't important for free software, which I said many times in my career, it was kind of ironic that I got this job. And of course, this game failed, more or less. So this is really the story of how it failed, but there was some transitional success that I think is worth learning from. And I think it's interesting to look at why FOSS couldn't really succeed in the online poker industry and probably will not be able to for at least a generation to come. So I will have to give some background on what poker is. It won't be very much. Does anybody have a working definition they want to share of what they think poker is as a game?
Filthy gambling.
It's a what?
Filthy gambling.
It's a filthy gambling game. Well, that's better than most definitions. Most people say it's like a card game. So this is the working definition of poker that I usually give people. The order matters. It's a gambling game of strategy played by people with money using cards in that order. Now the interesting thing is that online poker, the people aspect becomes a little bit weakened because a lot of real life poker is looking at a social environment and the psychology of the person you're interacting with. Online poker tends to be more about sociology than psychology. People track trends of the entire player base as opposed to any individual player's actions or behaviors in online poker. But online poker, at least in its most popular forms, is really about money. It is the most important central thing in all poker and online poker in particularly. Somebody once asked a famous poker player, why is money important? He goes, it's how we keep score, was his answer. Another famous poker player once said that the only way to be a good poker player is to have a very healthy disregard for the value of money. It's kind of this ironic thing that when you're playing poker, the money, you can't treat it like it's real money. Because even in the things that are the smallest games, which we would call small stakes or low stakes in poker, are games where you can win or lose $2,000 or $3,000 in an evening. High stakes are when you could win or lose $10,000 or $15,000 in a single evening. And the highest stakes, which are called nosebleed stakes, those are games where you can win $1 million or more in an evening. So the view of what money is like in poker is very strange, but it's also because it's gambling, because there's a gambling component to it. It's very popular. It's particularly popular in the US, the UK, and Australia. Of course, it's, especially in the US, it's fairly considered a game of the people. People play poker in their home games. Lots of people grow up in the US. I don't know what it's like in Australia. one of their family members had a weekly or a monthly poker game. It's pretty regular. And there's, in the United States at least, there's this like mythological history of the saloon poker of the 1800s in the West. And some of it is actually factual. Some of the stories that you hear about saloon poker. And casinos have offered poker worldwide since the late 1800s. It didn't rise to mainstream popularity until the very late 90s, and it's usually credited to this television show in the United Kingdom called Late Night Poker, which featured a specific, so poker is like a class of games. There are lots of different poker games, and in the 1990s, this show featured No Limit Texas Hold'em, which is kind of the most high drama of poker games, and so that was well suited for television viewing. Especially when they invented this thing called the hole card camera, so you could see the hole cards. If you don't know what people have and you don't know very much about poker, watching people play poker is really like watching paint dry. But seeing their hole cards and seeing what kind of decisions people are making made it viewable on television. So that's really when it took off. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the details of the rules of poker, but for this talk, and I'm going to use a couple of game theory words, so shoot your hand up if you don't know some of these game theory words. So poker is a zero-sum partial information game. Players are playing against each other, not a house. There's no house edge. I'll talk about that more in a minute. It's a game of skill. Better players over time win, and worse players over time lose. But there's a huge element of chance in poker. There's this really interesting essay in the history of poker. This famous poker theorist named David Skalansky considers the number of poker players in the world and how many games they play, and he sort of riffs off the idea that everybody says, I must be the unluckiest poker player in the world because I'm losing all the time. And he figured out that statistically, just about exactly one person of all the poker players in the world, in fact, is that person, and they have lost their whole career, even if they were the best player ever. Because statistically speaking, on the bell curve, there is somebody who just always gets bad cards. But there is this strong element of chance, which is why people play it as a gambling game. And it's actually very hard as a player to know whether you're good or bad without really studying your play. You could just be getting unlucky, or you could be playing badly. And poker players are famous for having all these theories of why, no, I didn't get unlucky. I didn't play badly. I just got unlucky. Here's why. And they have this sophistry that they create for that. Now, how does somebody who runs a poker game make any money? Because usually casinos run games where they have an edge. Like you sit down at a blackjack table in a casino, and they are making, even if you play optimally, and you don't count, and there's no card counting involved, they're making about 0.12% off of your money all the time, constantly, as you sit there. In poker, that's not happening because the players are playing against each other. So the house takes a fee, a surcharge to run the game, and that's usually called the rake. They take a fixed percentage out of each pot that everybody plays, and that's how they make money. So this was well suited for online play, because to run a brick and mortar poker game, well, you need a dealer and you need all these people, but to get a poker game online, all you need is this. And in fact, so this is a screenshot of a 1999 online poker system. Most poker games online today look pretty much like this. It's pretty much all you need. It's not very serious graphics, and in fact, users don't want big fancy UIs, and I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. So this online poker room launches called Planet Poker, and then Planet Poker has scalability issues. They get too many players, and the week they have their worst scalability issues, Paradise Poker decides to launch. Very smart. Paradise Poker becomes the main poker room online for the late 90s and early 2000s, and then others start launching as well. So it's actually relatively easy when you compare it to other types of games. There are some tricky bits about implementing a poker system. But generally, if you compare it to, sorry for the first typo, I only had 6 days. There are some typos in my slides. But if you compare it to other types of games that you build, like Poker Engine is kind of trivial compared to those other kind of games. It's completely turn-based. Everybody takes a turn, and there's always a state to the game, and the state is easily defined. An enum can define the state of a poker game very easily. there's really not much timing and network speed issues you have to deal with. There's a couple of things on the edges in tournaments, poker tournaments, people game with by taking longer to respond and so forth, and you have to account for that. But generally speaking, it's not like something happened there on their computer and then the server didn't know, and then you have to align it all like you have to do in first-person shooter games and so forth. Don't have to do any of that. And in fact, and I'll talk more about this later, the client doesn't need to know any secret information. So there's no need for like DRM or anything like that to avoid cheating, unless the site is cheating. I'll talk about that too. But generally speaking, you get your private cards, and you're the only one who gets them. No one else has to see them unless you have what's called a showdown at the end of the hand where people show their cards. So each client gets their copy of their cards. Anything that's public information is public to all the players. The hand continues, and you're fine. So you don't need to worry about keeping information secret from other players because there's no secret information that the client software needs to know. And as I mentioned before, the user interface that people actually want, that serious poker players actually want, is not some fancy graphics or anything. They just want the table and the cards. In fact, their goal is to get multiple tables going, so they want the cleanest, smallest window for each table that they can get. So the real challenges that you face, as we saw with Planet Poker when they started, is scaling as your player base gets bigger, to scale to handle millions and millions and millions of players, and the operational support software to keep the site running that has nothing to do with the actual game flow, and I'll talk about that more on a later slide. So there was a watershed moment in the history of poker. This guy named Chris Moneymaker, and it is his real name because nobody believed it, and they checked and found his birth certificate and such. He plays what's called a satellite tournament. This is a tournament where the prize is you get to enter another tournament. So he pays in 2003 or late 2002, he pays $86 to enter this tournament online. He wins an entry into the main event at the World Series in Poker in Las Vegas. He ultimately wins that event for $2.5 million. And so this is a rank amateur, just played this online poker thing. In fact, and there was a whole mythology about it. He was trying to get his friends to buy him out of the ticket because he really wanted the $10,000 rather than this entry that it was probably going to be worthless because he was probably going to lose the tournament. So of course he was glad he didn't do that. And this creates a huge boom in poker. There's enough online poker sites by that time that there's just tons and tons of ability for people to play. The three biggest at that time, from that era, from like 2003 to 2011, was Full Tilt Poker, PokerStars, and the Serious Poker Network, which is two sites, Ultimate Bet and Absolute Poker were the main sites there. There were dozens and dozens of skins, which were basically connecting the same poker network, but just had a different branding. There were other networks around that were smaller than these. Some country-based networks cropped up as countries started to regulate online poker for only playing against their own citizens. So it was like this heyday for online poker. There's an article, which is that the blue things are links when you get the slides on the website. It was estimated that it was something like $3.5 billion I think it was 2010 was the estimate of the online poker industry as a market. So it was really big. So where the heck was free and open source software in this whole thing? It was a classic scenario where free software was the most innovative in in poker generally, and they're first, but did not keep up as the market went big, and ultimately was not in that heyday in any real way. It turns out the very first online poker system was IRC poker. Is that anybody here ever played? Did it play IRC poker in the 90s, ever? I actually played IRC poker in the 90s a few times. Interestingly, it was written by a computer science PhD student named Chris Ferguson, who later was one of the co-founders, and swindlers, by the way, at Full Tilt Poker. But IRC poker was really poker for experts. It was hard to use. You had to understand IRC, first of all, in the 90s. It was mostly all these people who read this Usenet. How many people know what Usenet is? I worry. Good, okay. I get worried sometimes I'm going to say Usenet at some conference. People's going to what's Usenet, right? Okay, so rec.gambling.poker was a major hub of like expert poker player discussion. And they built this IRC poker thing to basically practice with each other. So it was really just the best players playing the best players for play money, but bragging rights were really important. So the play money actually had value to them because they were playing against the best. And they wanted to prove that they were better than the other great players. Now, nobody was maintaining this infrastructure. Chris Ferguson went all but dissertation, left grad school to become a non-ironically, professional poker player, or not surprisingly is what I meant. So nobody really maintained it, and it was gone by the time Planet Poker and Paradise Poker launched. So before I get into what happened in FOSS, I want to say a little bit more about the rules of poker and why they matter. So bear with me if you already know poker. So the way you win a hand of poker is you either get everybody else in the hand to fold by betting. That's where bluffing and so forth come in. Or when you get to the end of the hand, you compare your hands of all the people left, and the person with the best hand ranking wins. And there's a basic order of hands, which is that. But then there's many other variants of poker that have all sorts of different hand rankings. So there's low ball, where the lowest hand wins. There's split pot games, where the lowest hand splits the pot with the highest hand. There's games with their own set of hand rankings that kind of had nothing to do with the regular poker hand rankings at all. And the reason these games keep getting invented is because people would learn the odds of various different things in various different games, and then it was harder to beat players who knew the odds well. So other poker players would invent new games where nobody knew the odds, so they could kind of gamble again. Then somebody would work really hard to learn the odds and beat everybody else. So this would happen throughout the history of poker, going back 100 years, 150 years. So ultimately, the first software thing you need is a thing that evaluates hands. You basically have to be able to do comparison operators. You have this hand and this hand, and in this particular type of poker game, do they beat each other? Do they tie? And if they beat each other, who beats who? Right? And so this is what you needed first. Well, it turns out that the very, very first, the #1 software that ever existed in the world to do this was not only free software, it was GPL'd. It was the first comprehensive hand evaluator and statistical calculator for poker that was released in 1994. It was highly optimized. It's still amazingly fast today. The guy who wrote it, he actually developed bit masks for every game so that you could encode each of the hands in the minimum number of bits and then use bit masks to compare them. It's really neat code. It's very complicated code. I mean, it's C written in the 90s, if you want to. I mean, so it looks like C written in the 90s. And it was started by this guy, Cliff Matthews, from rec.gambling.poker in 1994. And I know for a fact, actually, because they contacted the PokerSource project, that if you ever seen poker on TV where they put the little percentages in the corner of like what's the likelihood to win? At least 2 of the shows use PokerSource to calculate that. And I actually think most of the online poker systems are using that hand evaluator. I can't imagine that anybody went through that painstaking effort to rewrite a fast hand evaluator. And I've really wondered sometimes. So it's GPL. Of course, the server side is what does the hand evaluation. So it's not on the client side. So they don't have to release their source code, even if it's based on GPL code. I wonder sometimes if we had network service copyleft in 1994 and PokerSource had been under that, would the whole online poker world look differently? So like open source does a good job at, there was an effort made to like, can we leapfrog this? So in 2004, 2003, 2004, it's obvious online poker is huge. Poker rooms are launching everywhere, both brick and mortar and online. And this company in France called Meek and Sleep decides to make the ultimate poker game. They're going to make 3D animated players that do chip tricks and all this sort of stuff. And it was like they hired somebody who did standard games graphics and built all these graphics and all this stuff. It all looked beautiful, like it looked like a real poker game. And yeah, it failed miserably. But as it turned out, they had hired as their CTO this friend of mine named Louis Zachary. I've known him for years. And so he calls me at like some point this is back when I worked for the Free Software Foundation in 2002, 2003. He gets me on IRC. He's like, I want to talk to you on the phone. And he called me. He says to me, you play a lot of poker, right? I'm like, that's a non sequitur. Like, why are you asking me? He's like, well, so I'm implementing a free software poker system from the ground up. You are? He's like, yeah, this company hired me. I'm their CTO, and we're doing this. And he said, like, we want to hire you as a consultant to be our like poker expert. And me being not a business person, I'm like, oh, I'll do it for free. Just call me on the weekends. Like, I don't care. Like, I'd be happy to like help see free software poker, whatever you need. So like, I became his like gameplay expert. And of course, the reason I trusted Loic to just do it for free was because Loic is a complete, morally firm free software author. He will never, ever write a line of proprietary code. So everything was going to be either under the Affero GPL or the GPL. So he starts to work on this 2003, 2004, 2005. And eventually the company fails. And the reason the company didn't fail, but that project failed. And the reason it did is because no one actually wants poker to be like a regular video game the way most people think about video games today. As was pointed out right when we started the talk, in essence, poker is gambling. And the goal is, if you're playing online poker, is to maximize the number of hands you can play per hour. Because if you're a good player, the more hands per hour you play, the more money you make. If you're a bad player, yes, the more money, the more you lose, but the more gamble you get. And so more gambling is what matters more than anything else as far as online poker goes. And no one wants to sit at one table, no matter how beautiful the graphics are, no matter how good the like animated players do chip tricks and have reverse tells that they give off to each other. No one wants to just sit there and do one table. They at least play 2 or 3. Most serious online poker players play hundreds of tables at once. Not hundreds, but like 100 tables at once, where they're just basically playing a very word strategy at very low stakes and just taking the whole games that they can. When I played online poker seriously back during the heyday, I would come home from work and go to this one site that I found where there were a lot of bad players, and I would open up 9 tables at once and play. And I would play the exact same strategy at every table, and people were playing so badly that we could make money very easily that way. And that's why this UI that online poker has, there's whistles and bells that people have added for certain types of quick folding features, quick like bet 3/4 pot features, those kinds of things. But generally speaking, the user interface is exactly as it was in '98. And every poker player who's serious about online poker wants it to look that way forever. They don't want more anything. They want it to just run fast and allow them to run lots of tables. So I think that we lost a lot of opportunity by not jumping on this, especially when these online cheating scandals started. Does anybody in the room know about like the various online poker cheating scandals? Okay, I'm going to cover them briefly. So that one network, which had Ultimate Bet and Absolute, it turns out, this is unbelievable, but they wrote, in their proprietary, of course, client, they wrote a God mode into the client. If you had a certain password, remember how I said how like there's no reason that the client needs to be shipped the whole cards of everyone else? Well, they did that in this particular implementation because they had a God mode, which you just typed in the God password, and you saw every card in every game. And it took a while for people to realize this, and the only reason they realized this is the original authors of this decided to cash out, and they found somebody to pay them a couple of million just to take over the God password. And that person who took it over used it stupidly, like classic stupid criminal. So what this person did was they would win in situations where they had no business winning. It became very obvious when you did statistical analysis. So there's this one particular, it's actually a really interesting story of community like getting together and working on transparency. So everybody who had hand history databases, because people who play online poker collect the hand histories, and so they get all the hands they played, they load them into databases, and everybody has their own hand history database, and they swap them. And so they all got their hand history databases together and discovered that this one player was winning way too much. And what they had is this one statistic in poker, which is called, I want to get the name right. It's called when you call as a loser, right? So somebody bets at you and you call and you lose the hand. Now, even the best poker players in the world, because it's statistically correct, they'll have about 60% of the time they call and lose, because that other 40% they call and they win a lot more, right? This person, they only called and lost 2% of the time. So 98% of the time when they called someone, they were the winner. And this was unbelievable. It ended up, for those of you that know poker will really like this story, at the very end, they finally caught the guy after this tournament where the final hand of the tournament, the one guy goes all in with 7 high, and he calls him with 8 high. And it's like, why did he do that? Because, of course, anybody smart would be like, if I play this guy for 10 more hands, I'll win anyway, because I see his cards every time. But it's like, I can be done. I can win $300,000 right now if I just click call. OK, I'm going to do that and go home, or go out to the bar or whatever. And so it was just really silly stuff. Then, on top of this, so this scandal was a big deal. It was covered in the U.S. news. A U.S. news magazine show called 60 Minutes did an entire show about that cheating scandal. But then, after that happened, it turned out Full Tilt Poker, which was founded by all professional poker players, people that the community knew and liked, including that guy Chris Ferguson I mentioned, Howard Lederer, who was another well-known poker player, co-founded the company with him. They were commingling the player deposits with their operating expenses. And then their operating expenses got to exceed what player deposits were, and then they couldn't pay players out. And so all these players couldn't get their money. So if we had a FOSS-based system where people could actually see the source code of the client, to know that it doesn't have a God password, for example, to know that it's not getting the cards of everybody else, we had an opportunity. It was really a missed opportunity for free software. I think the reason that we missed the opportunity for free software so completely was because everybody was like, let's make the game great. Let's keep working on the game. The game is not really the most important software you need if you want to run online poker. You need to be able to cash people in and out, so you need cashier. You need to basically run a little tiny bank, and you need software to run that little tiny bank seamlessly and straightforwardly, and you have to comply with regulations, which I'll talk in a minute. The regulations got more and more heavy as online poker became more popular. You need to be able to manage a huge database of players. And you need to be able to market to them because there's lots of competition. You need to be able to communicate with them. You need all that kind of software that does, Civi CRM type, not Civi CRM, but Sugar CRM type stuff, right? None of that really exists for online poker as free software. You also need to be able to check the more mundane. I mean, I talked about these big cheating scandals, but there's the mundane cheating scandal of online poker, which is you and your friends sit on the phone with each other, or 3 friends sit at a table together, and you wait for somebody to show up unwittingly, and you're all sharing information, and that person has no chance. If 3 people at the table are working together against you, you're in big trouble. But there's software that all these big proprietary poker companies that can detect certain behaviors, which they keep the information proprietary, of when people are colluding. But we don't have any of that. We don't have any of that kind of AI type software for free software poker. So today, there is source code. I was going to put it out. It's like actually not, the repository is not up online anywhere. I have it on my laptop. I'm going to put it online. If I had known the talk, even just 12 days before I had to give it, I would have had it up. But it's it works. In fact, the thing that Loic paid me to do when he was paying me as a consultant was to write test coverage for the entire server. The entire server has 100% test coverage. Every line of code is tested. Thanks, I did that. I'm proud of that. I sat there and wrote tests every weekend for like 6 months in Python. But you couldn't launch an online poker business with it, at least not a real money online poker business. But interestingly enough, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pause my mic for a second. I apologize. You couldn't really launch an online poker system for real money because you didn't have all that other support software. But what Loic did, which was really smart, is he built this consulting business. I came up with that name, Outflop, which is only funny to a poker player. And he took the existing code and we found a big client, which was a French social media site that said, oh, we just want to deploy it for play money. Well, it's a perfect system for deploying for play money because it doesn't have any of the stuff you need if real money's involved. But if people just want to play for, to beat their friends and maybe win a few prizes, it worked great. And Loic designed the company in a really interesting way. So it was a network of contractors. I didn't even know that they had this client. I was just sitting there writing test code all day. And Loic managed the relationship with the client, and then he posted small tasks on various different code, find a code, rent a coder, those kind of sites, saying, oh, I need this done, I need this done. He broke all the stuff that needed to be done into tiny little 2-week project chunks. and then got all these contractors to work on it. It was really kind of an amazing thing. So all these people were getting paid part-time, including me, to work on this thing. And it went on for about 3 years, where we were just getting these kinds of little clients here and there that wanted to run poker sites. In the end, what happened was, of course, this is during the huge poker boom. Everybody wanted to get into the online poker business, including entities like Russian organized crime. And so Outflop finally ended when Loic had a client who hadn't paid him. And they said, go to this metro station in Paris at 7 p.m. tomorrow night. Somebody would be there to pay you the 5,000 euro we owed you in cash. We all begged Loic to not collect that $5,000 because we weren't sure if he was going to get $5,000 in that metro station or stabbed. And that's when we realized, like, we do not want to write software for people who want to pay us in a even if it's free software in a metro station in cash. So we never collected that invoice, and the company folded at that point because it was obvious that anybody who was going to pay for the free software stuff were basically cutting corners because the big proprietary companies had pretty much taken over. Now, I think the interesting thing is I think those 3 years is basically a success. Well, that code base is basically dead. It still works, but nobody's maintaining it. Heck, the source code is on mine and Loic's. I have most of the repository on my laptop. Loic has it on backup, and I actually, 6 days ago, I emailed him asking to pull it off backup, but he didn't have time. But I still think it was successful. Not every FOSS project is going to last for generations, like Linux. But a bunch of free software coders got paid to write free software code for a couple of years, and I think there's a certain success aspect to that. I think, however, there's no future for free software online poker at this point. In the United States, on October 13th, 2006, this law was passed called the UIEGA, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Act, Gambling Enforcement Act, typo, sorry. And it's the typical way the US writes legislation. So it doesn't make playing online poker illegal. It makes it illegal for banks to process transactions for online poker sites. So players were still allowed to play, it's just you couldn't cash out anymore because no bank could handle the transaction legally. So the sites kept running. The Department of Justice warned them on that date, you all need to cease. Party Poker was the only one that answered and said, okay, we will cease operations effective immediately in the United States. All the other ones kept running. And they found more and more ingenious ways to process transactions. Full Tilt found fraudulent ways. So they formed a golf supply company that was a front. They formed, I mean, people were getting checks from like these weird companies when they would cash out because they were just basically laundering the money. And of course, commingling all the funds, as I mentioned. So everything went horribly wrong. And this is when Full Tilt's pyramid scheme really became obvious. So on April 15th, the Department of Justice got warrants to take over all the URLs, all the domain names of all the online poker sites still operating in the US. So they all just went down immediately. Of course, then Full Tilt, everybody tried to cash out immediately. There was a run at the banks, and the ones who didn't have segregated funds were lost. And it was within weeks, people knew that they had been swindled. The really interesting thing that happened, this is just such an interesting play by PokerStars. So they made the first deal. They were first at the door at the Department of Justice. And what they said is, we'll buy Full Tilt's debt because we know they can't pay their players. We will pay every fine that PokerStars and Full Tilt owe the United States Department of Justice with an agreement that we can operate when states start to regulate online gaming in the United States, because the states were still allowed within the US to start their own poker rooms for that state. Because, of course, federal banks can't. It's very similar to what's happening with marijuana in the United States, where it's like federally illegal, but states, if they don't do federal banking, are allowed to do it. So what happened is the PokerStars consolidated the market completely. PokerStars and Full Tilt were the two biggest sites. Full Tilt's now a scam. PokerStars made everybody whole in the end, if you remembered to apply in time for the process. So I'm never getting that $60 that I had left in Full Tilt. But I heard about it like 3 days after the last deadline. I was like, oh my God. But fortunately, I had already moved all my money out because I was like People are getting checks from golf companies. I'm not putting any money in here that I think is like, it's not real money anymore, I don't think. So now, there's really no way to become a competitor in this market. I don't think a FOSS competitor would have a chance unless they made like a deal with a single municipality or something like that. I think it's pretty hopeless. So you might say, well, what about the play money thing? Isn't there a future in play money? And I think the biggest problem with play money, well, there's two problems. The first problem is, you could deploy this thing for play money. It's full test coverage. It's great. But why is no one doing it? Well, all this time, all this other poker stuff going on, there's one company, Zynga, which is well known for like lots of little social network games. They were Facebook Poker for years and years. I don't know if they still are, but Facebook Poker was Zynga. And they built up a player base there, and there was all this talk about Zynga was gonna like turn it, like convert it to a real money play, but when all the weird legal stuff happened, they just kept doing it, play money for prizes, and everybody who's willing to play money just basically uses Facebook Poker. And there's really no chance for anybody to compete because there's no chance for anybody to really compete with Facebook and social media either. Like, I mean, I kind of think it would be cool if there was like a Mastodon-based online poker system based on PokerSource. But then there's the other problem, which is that if anybody really likes poker, they believe it's a game of people played with money with cards. And if you take the money component out, poker players lose interest real fast. There's got to be something of value on the line for poker players to take the game very seriously. So it's really hard to find people who know a lot and care about poker, like me, for example. Of course, I have a much more important job at my day job. But on the other hand, I wouldn't even be into it because I'm like, play money, really? Do I care? So I don't know where that leaves us, right? With online poker, with free software poker. I think it's an interesting thing to look at and consider, like, is this something free software could do, should do? Would it make people a game that they would like? I don't know. Should we run a free software play money site that's just community run? Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so I don't really have an ending per se, because I only had 6 days, remember. But anyway, I'm happy to take, since we don't have anything after us, I'm happy to like take questions or just if anything you want to know about like Bitcoin poker, because I can talk about that too. I didn't put it in the talk. So feel free to ask anything you want.
So I have a mic, if anyone's got any questions. Surely someone's got a question. No?
Is anyone using AI to play poker online these days? Or?
So it's interesting that the sites have done a tremendous amount of work to make bot play very difficult. And this actually, I should have put that on my list of like that operational software that's needed, so they can detect bots. In fact, people who use like little just macros and stuff, they will get CAPTCHAs popping up at them on the sites to make sure they're really a human playing. So that they put a tremendous amount of effort into that. The interesting thing that's happening, I don't follow the AI research in poker very much, in part because the people who do the AI research, I don't think they're real poker players, frankly, because they focus on the games that they can win with AI. So Limit Hold'em has been basically beaten by AIs, and there's AI algorithms that work great to beat Limit Hold'em. Heads Up No Limit, which is just 2 players, No Limit Hold'em, is pretty much beaten by AIs, and there's actually an annual tournament of computer science schools that they do a big poker tournament of course they only play No Limit Hold'em Heads Up because that's the only game they know how to beat. I think it will be, I went to computer science grad school, I didn't specialize in AI, but I took AI and I follow poker a lot. I think it will be a long time before you can really make a successful AI player that can beat a full table of good players interacting with each other, because that interaction is much harder to track. When you have one player to analyze, it's pretty straightforward. And in fact, Heads Up, 2-player No Limit Hold'em, no one will play that game anymore, even 2 humans, because the difference between like the excellent players and the good players is so wide. Like if you're an excellent player, you just beat everybody because if you specialize in that game. So I think it's going to be a long time before computers are beating people at like full table poker. At least no limit poker anyway.
I've actually got a question. Do you think this sort of ties into a general trend in that, because games and FOSS have always sort of been these two separate worlds, have we left it too late for any games and FOSS to sort of have closer coordination? Is it always doomed to become this?
I don't know. I think there are enough, one of the reasons I want to give this talk is I think there are enough unique things about poker that I don't think come up, and like the user interface doesn't matter kind of thing, which are very unique to that. It seems to me poker would have been the easiest, in part because user interface doesn't matter. So I don't know. I don't know much about the rest of the game world. I do think that's a general FOSS challenge of trying to constantly catch up with proprietary software. We've been doing that for decades at this point. They're like, oh, proprietary software does this. We have to be able to do it too. So I think just looking at that general model, not just in games, I think we're always going to be a little bit behind. I think the big problem is any environment where I think other games probably have a better chance because they can be very different type of games that you can write. Like poker is really rote in the way that it works, and rewriting it from scratch is difficult, but gets basically the same outcome of stuff you already have. Whereas if you came up with a completely different game, like you take Godot and you make a game that looks very different than games that people have seen before, that seems like it has more potential to me. I think poker may just be a kind of a hopeless area for a variety of reasons that the rest of the gaming world doesn't interact with. But I'm not an expert on games at all, so I could be wrong.
How did the pay in and pay out sort of mechanisms work in that period? Was it credit card based, or
talking about
you mentioned check at some point?
So you're talking about the period before the legislation, or like the U.S. legislation? Like which period? There's like 3 different periods. So
yeah.
do you want me to tell you all of them?
All the way through.
All the way
That'd
through.
be great.
Right. So initially they did take PayPal. So PayPal was the standard way, and I think it was 2001 when PayPal said they would not accept any gaming transactions at all. So then that ended. So PayPal was out at that point. What typically happened before the UIGA, so before 2006, so 2001, 2006, is you would have to use a bank account. So you'd have to like do a withdrawal from a bank account, not a credit card, and then you could have to get paid out by check. I was never sure why that was in those days because they could do the transactions normally. Then after 2006, everything went to paper checks everywhere, right? So it actually became really hard to buy in. You would have to like mail checks to them or something like that. People did a lot of transferring money around, so you could transfer between player accounts. So people would buy each other's player balances a lot. And so that sort of happened then. And then it was really hard to cash out. Most of them were 60 or 90-day wait periods to cash out from 2006 to 2011. And then when 2011 hit, which they call it Black Friday, is what it's called in the poker community, when all those sites shut down, everybody thought they were broke. In fact, there were people, they actually made out really well. So there were people, because people had, poker players are not good with money, as you might imagine. So there were well-known poker players who had, $1.5 million at Full Tilt, 500,000 at PokerStars. And so people went around and bought player balances for like 10 cents on the dollar. And there are a number of people, nobody really knows who they are, who are probably multimillionaires because they went and bought all these player balances, and then sure enough, PokerStars made everybody whole in the end. So these people got millions and millions of dollars from all these player balances that were floating around out there. So it was a really weird time, and that's when I quit playing online poker myself personally. Was when it became like I would get like each time I would cash out from a poker site, it came from a different company. I was like, I'm cashing everything out. So I left like $100 in every site to just fool around with, and then I was like, I'm not doing anything else. So and then there was Bitcoin. So once Bitcoin hit, Bitcoin poker became a thing, which I can talk about if people are interested.
If you could talk about that.
Yeah, so the Bitcoin poker thing was really interesting because, of course, nobody was treating Bitcoin as a currency in the beginning, and it also wasn't worth very much. So 3 different sites launched with Bitcoin, and people talk about it now because people were playing like the standard game on that site was $1, $2 Bitcoin, which would be a game where you could win or lose 500 to 600 Bitcoins in a session. right? And of course, at that time, they were playing with $15, $20 worth of Bitcoin. And people talk in the poker world now that like, these were the highest stakes players on the internet at the time, and they just didn't know it yet. So, I mean, Bitcoins were just flying around in online poker. And there were sites, in fact, there were 3 different sites that we discovered that, like seedy sites that had taken PokerSource, and we did GPL enforcement against them to shut them down in one case anyway, because they took PokerSource and just launched a Bitcoin site with it. And I mean, it was like, because it was just so easy to do. So you just put a Bitcoin address up there and so forth, and you can play. One of them finally got raided. So after the IRS in the United States started paying attention to Bitcoin, there was a guy who was running a Bitcoin poker site that was called Seals with Clubs was its name. That's horrible. That's what it was called. And so he got raided by the federal government in the US, and they seized all the assets. So all that money disappeared. And there's still, most people who play in the United States play on Bitcoin sites now because they're not really regulated in the US, and it's easy to get money in and out. Because remember, the only thing that's illegal is the bank transactions. With Bitcoin, you don't need any bank transactions. The guy they raided, they were able to argue that he was acting as a bank, basically, but most of the Bitcoin sites now run offshore. So you can buy into them with like just by transferring to a Bitcoin address and so forth. I would presume by now, given that Bitcoin is where it's at, and that there other cryptocurrency sites exist. I haven't looked in a while, but I would be surprised if like almost every cryptocurrency does not have at least some dinky little poker site somewhere.
No, yep. Is there a poker community outside of the US that's obviously not affected by all the US laws?
So you're saying was the worldwide poker community impacted by the US laws? Is that what you're asking, or?
No, it's like your talk was obviously focused on the US and US laws and everything. There's like 180 other countries that presumably have poker communities.
So I can talk a little bit about what happened around the world. So pretty quickly in sort of the mid 2000 period when poker was worldwide very, very popular. Pretty much every country in Europe, a number of South American countries, they all relatively quickly regulated online poker for their own countries, right? So, and this is again where PokerStars was on it. So PokerStars launched the first country gated poker site, PokerStars.it in Italy. And pretty much every gate, like if you go to a country and you see ads for online poker, even if it's branded differently, it's probably PokerStars running it. Because they went around to every country and made deals with them. Because the countries all seem to want, there was really no, and it's happening within the states in the US too, like they don't want to share, in poker we call it sharing equity. So they want to gate all the citizens of this one country where they can only play against other citizens in that country. I guess under the theory that all the money stays in that country. And of course they all have their different tax regimes, right? So they all have different ways that they tax the particular gambling, so it'd be harder to make like multi-country deals. And it turns out that most gamblers don't care that much as long as there's enough player liquidity. And by player liquidity, what I mean is there's enough new players coming in that the reasonably good players have somebody to take money from. So pretty much all these country-gated sites have enough liquidity to survive. And that's what's basically happened, is that the online poker community is segmented country to country, and within the US, it's within states. Like some states it's illegal, some states they have a gated state within, poker within there. The interesting thing is that the global poker community, the poker community is always very global, right? Because there's casinos all over the world, and there's big tournaments at all these different casinos all over the world. And what the fragmentation of worldwide online poker did impact the way the poker community sort of was connected. Because now these players weren't playing against each other. There were some interesting effects to that because so it's actually a well-known joke in the poker community that like basically the Scandinavian poker players came in and they were just really, really good and they were beating everybody. There was like some like clandestine poker school in Finland that was teaching people how to play really, really well, because it was Finnish player after Finnish player and Norwegian players just coming and winning everything. And they were just dominating online poker for a while. Well, once all these countries sort of separated out, it meant that there wasn't this quick move of money to the top players. And that's the biggest thing that kind of kills poker, is when there's a certain number of good players where the money just kind of floats up to them, and then everybody else just has no chance. And so because of that, while it's more segmented, so there are not as much connections internationally, which was kind of a neat thing about poker, on the other side of it is that in a given country, there's like, you don't have to face the best competition in the world in your country on online poker. So that's a benefit.
Hi, Bradley. Just wondering if you could comment, if you're able to, about how all of the things you've spoken about, you know, the rise of online poker and then this regulation, how has it affected how people play poker in the real world, in casinos or in their lounge rooms or whatever?
So the interesting thing that happened was poker went on internet time, basically at the moneymaker moment. It was really rare for people to get better at poker, and it took them a very long time when I started playing poker in the 90s. And there were books, right? And there's this publisher called 2+2 that's the premier publisher of poker books. And people would it would take 5 years from somebody to start changing the way that they played, and then they would write about it and then publish a book, and then everybody would be using that strategy, and then people would come with counter strategies. So that was like a multi-year process in the early days. Online poker, and not just online poker, but online discussion communities about poker. So that same publisher, 2+2, runs a giant web forum to discuss poker strategy. Those two things together cause poker to change drastically every 3 to 6 months. So like when I look at an online poker game now, even at the lowest stakes, I couldn't beat them without study, because they're just, the strategies that people are using are counter strategies to counter strategy, that I wasn't following the last 5 years, 6 years. And I just don't know what they're doing. And I mean, I can guess, but I'd have to go read forums and do that. So it really stylized the way people got better at poker in a way that it made it a lot less fun for a lot of people, right? So it's really hard to get into online poker and play and enjoy yourself because you just lose. Right, and another interesting thing that happened was the sites that still operate internationally, they're dominated by players in the developing world who are just playing multi tables of very, very low stakes. So even if you go into the games where you can only win or lose $15, right? There are people sitting there who are really, really excellent players, just grinding to collect, because in their particular country, $15 is a lot more value to them than it would be in the countries where the other players are coming from. So that's changed a lot too. It's really kind of turned it into just like a shark den that it wasn't when it started. Live poker is pretty much the same. So I was at the LCA you organized. I don't know if people noticed that we're next to a casino again. But the Tasmanian LCA in Hobart was literally at a casino, as it turned out. I assume Chris did that for me, I suppose. But what's that? You're welcome. Thank you. So those of you that were there, if you did wander into the poker room, I was there 2 of the nights, including the last night, the Friday night. I played all night until my flight, because that's what poker players do. So it was actually, that's actually a counterexample to what I was just saying, because when you have a small environment like that. So I sat down and the entire table was playing really well, and I sat there for a few hours, and I finally just said, everybody's quiet, which is rare. You're at a table of good players when nobody's talking. Usually people, if they're there to be social, they're actually talking. So finally, about 2 hours in, I said, why are you all so good at poker, I meant? And they go, one of them pipes up and says, you're looking at the entirety of the Tasmanian poker community right here. And I said, well, but why do you all sit in this game? Because the rake is winning, because it's a negative sum game when you have a rake, because the house is taking a certain amount, so you have to beat the rake and the other players at the same time, which means you have to beat that much more. They said, well, we just sit here waiting for a tourist to show up, And could you leave because you're too good and you're taking a seat that a tourist is usually in? But when you go to a large, like when I lay over in Sydney, I went to the casino in Sydney, and like it was like any other poker game. Like there's still, like most people don't know what they're doing. They're just there to gamble, basically. But online poker, it's just like sharks everywhere.
For the server side, how much do you care about distinguishing between human and robot players? Do you care if there's robots playing against robots in a similar way to robots trading on the stock market?
It's an interesting question. So there was a site called Poker Room, which was one of the early sites in the early 2000s. And that site was at the highest stakes, that site was almost all bots. You would sit down and it was obvious that it was all bots. Bots are usually, and limit hold'em bots are, you know, they don't win a lot, but if you just keep them running, they win enough to be worth it. Generally speaking, in the poker industry, they really try to prevent this. I'm not, and it's against the terms of service of every poker site to run a bot, and they cut off accounts. Famously, somebody who had written a bot that was winning, he got banned for life from all poker sites, basically, for running a bot that was winning, not a lot, but of course it can run 24/7, and you don't have to do anything. Limit hold'em is not all that popular anymore. It's a little less like I was saying. I would suspect that there are people who figure out how to run bots for those 2-player no limit hold'em tables. I'm sure there's lots of AI bots sitting there waiting for some sucker to sit down with them. But pretty much nobody will play that game anymore. Whether they're bots playing each other, I don't know. I don't know why a site would care that much because they're getting the rake. I think the reason they care is more of a perception issue. Right, because it's generally thought, like if you go sit over to this casino, I assume this casino has poker. I haven't checked yet, believe it or not. But if you go sit at a poker table, like you ask half the players, they think online poker is a scam. Like most people in the poker, like the average poker player just assumes it's a scam, especially after all these scandals, right? I mean, they've heard something about like, oh, those guys were stealing a bunch of money, weren't they? So I think the poker sites put a tremendous amount of effort to say, no, you're playing against real people. We vet them. We know they're real people just like you, and so forth. So I think it's more perception than it is anything else. Why there's such a no bots allowed philosophy by most poker sites. I think it would be great if somebody wanted to take PokerSource and just like use it as a bot playing farm to play with. Like I wish the people who did the competitions, the computer science competitions, would use our code base. They all have their own university secret code bases that they use, unfortunately. And they also don't care about any game but heads up, no limit hold'em. So there's that too.
Well, I think that's it for questions. Could everyone please join me in thanking Bradley?